It's a scorching summer morning in the year 552 AD. The hills of Umbria sit under a blazing sun, the kind of heat that rises off the ground even before noon hits. And on that dry earth, two armies stand face to face, each preparing for a battle that could reshape the future of Italy. This is the town of Taginae, a small place on the map, but today, it's about to become the stage for a turning point in the Gothic War, a conflict that has dragged on for 18 long, exhausting years. What started as Emperor Justinian's grand plan to restore Rome's lost western lands has turned into a brutal, grinding war that has chewed up the Italian peninsula piece by piece. On one side of this battlefield stands Totila, the young and charismatic king of the Ostrogoths. He's dressed in ornate armor, mounted confidently on his warhorse, and surrounded by a force that's smaller than his enemies, but fast, mobile, and strategically placed on terrain he knows inside out. On the other side is Narses, a man no one ever expected to become a general, a court eunuch turned commander, soft-spoken but razor-sharp in strategy, now leading a massive and diverse Byzantine army. Narses isn't the kind of leader who gives fiery speeches. He leads quietly through planning structure and an attention to detail that borders on obsessive. Around them, warriors from every corner of the known world gather: Greeks, Armenians, Huns, Goths, Slavs, all praying, sharpening weapons, and preparing themselves for what many believe will be the defining clash of the war. The Battle of Taginae won't end the conflict outright, but what happens here will flip the direction of the war. By nightfall, one army will break and one leader will not survive. To really understand how both sides ended up here, you have to rewind a bit. After his stunning victory at the Battle of Faventia in 542, Totila launched a relentless campaign to reclaim Italy for the Goths. In December of 546, after a long and painful siege, he captured Rome itself. Even though the city had lost much of its political weight, by then it still held huge symbolic power. But the way Totila took the city was brutal. Starvation swept through Rome. Betrayal inside the walls opened the gates for the Goths. And in a symbolic move, Totila ordered part of the Aurelian walls torn down, a physical insult to Roman authority. But Totila's grip on Rome didn't last long. In 547, Belisarius, Justinian's legendary general, took the city back and started rebuilding its defenses. The problem: Belisarius had barely any reinforcements, almost no resources, and an emperor who simply wouldn't send help. Rome, once the center of the world, was now a pawn, traded back and forth, battered each time. By 549, Totila captured it again, mainly because the Byzantine presence was stretched too thin to stop him. Between 549 and 550, Totila tightened Gothic control across central and southern Italy. He even raided Sicily and tried pushing toward the Dalmatian coast. And here's the interesting part: he wasn't just fighting, he was also negotiating. Totila reached out to Constantinople, offering peace terms that would give the Goths autonomy under loose Byzantine oversight. Justinian rejected the idea immediately. Instead, he prepared for a fresh push into Italy. And to lead it, he selected someone unexpected: Narses. Now, Narses wasn't young. He was over 70 years old in age when most men of that era were long retired or dead. But Justinian wasn't looking for a battlefield hero. He wanted someone loyal, disciplined, and politically safe. And Narses fit that perfectly. This wasn't the first time he proved his worth either. Back in 532, during the infamous Nika riots, when Constantinople nearly fell apart as the blues and greens burned half the city, Narses walked into the hippodrome alone and turned the tide with gold, promises, and sheer political intelligence. Later, Justinian sent him to Italy as a secondary commander, where he clashed repeatedly with Belisarius, so much so that Justinian eventually recalled him. But Justinian never forgot him. And when the Gothic War started slipping away again, he knew exactly who to call. In 551, Narses returned to command, this time with full authority. No rival generals, no court interference, no resource shortages. Justinian gave him money, autonomy, and total control. For the first time in years, the Byzantine army entering Italy was not starving, fractured, or outnumbered. It was one of the most diverse armies the empire had assembled. Byzantine regulars, Armenian infantry, Slavic auxiliaries, Hun horsemen, Heruli warriors, Lombards, and even Gothic defectors. Over 30,000 men marched under Narses, but Narses wasn't reckless. Instead of rushing into Italy like his predecessors, he advanced slowly and methodically along the Adriatic coast. The supply lines were secured. The towns along the coast were taken one by one. He refused to repeat old mistakes. Totila, desperate to slow him down, assembled a fleet of around 300 ships to cut off Byzantine supply routes. But the Gothic navy was no match for the Byzantine experience at sea. Near Senigallia in late 551, the Gothic fleet was crushed. 36 ships lost, the rest scuttled. Overnight, Totila lost the sea along with his chance of stopping Narses' advance. With the Adriatic secured, Narses pushed deeper into Italy in the spring of 552. He moved through the Julian Alps down into the Po Valley and toward the heartland still held by the Goths. While others before him had overextended their forces by trying to occupy too much territory too quickly, Narses focused only on the essentials, roads, mountain passes, fortresses that controlled movement. Everything else he ignored. By mid-year, Narses reached the Umbrian frontier, the last real gateway into Totila's strongholds. Totila knew he couldn't afford to wait anymore. With his naval power destroyed and reinforcements impossible, he had to face Narses head-on. His army was still formidable, made of hardened cavalry veterans and die-hard Gothic infantry. But it wasn't as large, and it wasn't as well supplied. The two armies closed in near the small town of Taginae, a narrow, rugged region of valleys, ridges, and forests. Totila hoped to use the terrain to force the Byzantines into a tight space where his cavalry could hit hardest. But Narses refused to be trapped. Instead, he found a broad open stretch of the Via Flaminia and positioned his entire army in a wide crescent formation, infantry in the center. Archers fanned out and cavalry hidden on the flanks. Totila had hoped to dictate the battlefield. Instead, Narses now controlled everything. The night before the battle, the two camps prepared in their own ways. Narses walked quietly through his camp, inspecting formations, confirming supply readiness, offering calm, deliberate words to officers. Eastern troops prayed softly in Greek and Syriac. Mercenaries from the steppes sharpened blades and murmured old tribal chants. Narses gathered his officers in a small tent for prayer. No speech, no theatrics, just a focused mind preparing for one of the most important battles of his life. Totila, meanwhile, moved through his own camp, addressing soldiers by name, reminding them of their past victories, Faventia Rome, their years of survival. That night among the Gothic ranks, Christian prayers mixed with older pagan traditions. Before darkness fell, Totila stood before his elite cavalry and vowed to lead them from the front. His men believed in him. They always had. And by dawn, both armies were ready. At sunrise, the battlefield at Taginae began to take shape. Totila looked across the open ground and saw Narses' army stretched out in that wide crescent formation, infantry holding steady at the center. Archers spread along both wings and the rest hidden just out of sight. Totila couldn't see what Narses was planning, but he could feel it. This wasn't a commander rushing to meet him. This wasn't a man making mistakes. Narses had chosen his ground carefully, and Totila knew it. Before committing to the fight, Totila tried something unusual, something nearly every historian since has talked about. Instead of charging immediately, he walked his horse into the open space between the two armies in full gleaming armor, purple accents marking him as a king, and began to perform an exhibition of horsemanship. He galloped in tight circles, pulled off sharp turns, and even hurled his spear into the air, catching it on the way down with almost dancer-like precision. Procopius, the historian who chronicled these events, compared it to a performance, not a reckless display, but a calculated attempt to raise the spirits of his men, intimidate the Byzantines, and most importantly, buy time. Totila was waiting for reinforcements, a cavalry detachment of about 2,000 men under his trusted commander Taya. And during this delay, something else happened, a duel. A Gothic warrior named Cacus rode out and challenged the Byzantines. The one who stepped forward to answer the call was Anzalas, an Armenian horseman. In front of both armies, Anzalas struck Cacus down. It didn't win the battle, but it was a symbolic blow. Finally, after Taya's reinforcements arrived and after Totila returned from changing into more practical armor, the moment came. Totila ordered the attack. What followed was classic Totila, fast, decisive, and full of confidence. He sent his elite cavalry forward in a massive wedge formation, thundering down the gentle slope of the battlefield. Hooves hammered the earth, dust rose behind them. The Gothic warriors believed they were about to smash straight through the Byzantine center, the same way they had crushed so many others throughout the war. But Narses had been waiting for exactly that. Totila's cavalry charge entered the arc of the Byzantine crescent, and that's when Narses unleashed the trap. From both wings, Byzantine archers began releasing volleys of arrows inward at an angle. This wasn't just scattered fire, it was disciplined, layered, continuous. One line shot while another reloaded, creating an almost unbroken stream of missiles pouring down on the advancing Goths. Procopius wrote that the barrage was so thick it seemed to darken the sky, and immediately the impact was devastating. Horses faltered, riders veered off course. The tight formation Totila needed to break the Byzantine line began to unravel before it even reached the infantry. And then Narses gave the next signal. Like floodgates opening, cavalry units hidden on both flanks, Heruli Lombards, and other allies surged forward and hit the sides of Totila's cavalry. The Goths suddenly found themselves pinned from three directions. They had nowhere to maneuver. The narrow terrain which Totila had hoped to use to his advantage now worked against him. Their cavalry wedge didn't just collapse, it was crushed and enveloped. Totila had gambled everything on that first strike, and as soon as it failed, the entire structure of the Gothic attack began to fall apart. Behind the cavalry, Gothic infantry watched as their strongest force, their hammer, their pride was torn apart. Confusion spread instantly. Without clear orders, without leadership, the foot soldiers hesitated, some retreated, some tried to hold the line, some simply froze, and in that moment of hesitation, the Byzantine infantry pushed forward while Narses' reserve cavalry sealed the trap completely. The battle turned into a rout. No dramatic comeback, no last stand, just the crushing realization that Totila's strategy had been outmatched by Narses' preparation. But the true turning point came with one moment, the death of Totila himself. Different historical accounts describe it differently. Some say he fell in the thick of the combat. Others say he tried to escape after realizing the battle was lost and was struck down on the way out. But everyone agrees on one thing: when Totila fell, the Ostrogothic army collapsed completely. Totila wasn't just a commander. He was the heart of the army, the symbol of their resistance, the man who had revived Gothic power when everyone thought it was dead. Losing him wasn't just a tactical loss, it was a psychological one. His loyal men carried his body away and buried him in secret, not wanting the Byzantines to parade him as a trophy. Back on the battlefield, Totila's second-in-command pulled together what remained of the Gothic army and managed to lead a small fraction of them to safety. Narses, meanwhile, refused to let victory turn into chaos. Unlike many commanders who would give in to the adrenaline of pursuit, Narses kept his troops disciplined. No reckless chasing, no scattering. He moved forward in coordinated steps, eliminating resistance pockets while preserving the strength of his own army. By the time the fighting was fully over, Gothic casualties were estimated around 8,000 to 10,000, most of them cavalrymen, the core, the veterans, the backbone of Totila's army. Byzantine losses were remarkably low, likely around 1,500. When the dust of Taginae settled, it was clear this was the decisive moment of the Gothic War. Not the final battle, but the one that broke the Ostrogothic kingdom. Totila's cavalry was gone. His leadership was gone. And Italy, after nearly 2 decades of destruction and famine, betrayal, and shifting control, was finally back within Byzantine reach. In the aftermath, Narses wasted no time. Rome, Ravenna, and other major cities were brought back under imperial administration. New garrisons were installed. The empire wanted order restored fast, but reality on the ground was far more complicated. 20 years of war had devastated Italy. Fields had been abandoned, towns emptied, trade routes broken. Disease and famine had cut down entire communities. Byzantine authority existed mostly in name outside the biggest cities. And ironically, many local Italians had come to prefer the Ostrogoths, who had kept Roman institutions intact and ruled with relative stability over the heavy-handed imperial approach. Still, the Goths weren't completely finished. They elected a new king, Totila, the same commander who escaped the battlefield with the last remaining Gothic troops. But what he inherited was no longer a kingdom. It was a desperate remnant of a once powerful nation, scattered, exhausted, and surrounded. One final confrontation remained a last stand to decide Italy's fate once and for all. And it would take place not on a plain, but on the dark, volcanic slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The fall of Totila didn't just end a battle, it shattered the spine of the Ostrogothic kingdom. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. The Byzantines had won at Taginae, but the Goths still had one last breath left in them. One final surge of resistance led by a man who had already survived the impossible Totila. Totila wasn't a charismatic king like Totila. He wasn't a symbol of Gothic resurgence, but he was something the Goths desperately needed: a hardened survivor. a commander who understood exactly what was at stake. The kingdom he inherited after Taginae was barely a kingdom at all. The major strongholds had already been retaken by the Byzantines. The elite cavalry was mostly dead. Entire regions of Italy had been stripped bare by decades of war. Farms collapsed, roads overrun, villages lost to famine or disease. But Taya wasn't interested in surrender. He rallied the remaining troops, a patchwork of Gothic veterans, scattered survivors, local supporters, and he set up what he knew would be the final defensive stand of his people. That stand took place in early 553 on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, near a place called Mons Lactarius. If Taginae was a showdown between two well-prepared armies, Mons Lactarius was a brutal last stand, fierce, desperate, and fought with the understanding that there would be no retreat and no reinforcements. Taya positioned his remaining forces high along the rocky ridges, forcing the Byzantines to fight uphill. Narses, knowing how dangerous cornered warriors could be, advanced with calculated caution. The battle lasted 2 days, and it was vicious. Gothic soldiers fought with the intensity of men who knew their homes. Families and entire identity were hanging by a thread. Taya himself fought on the front lines, dual-wielding shields at one point, holding back wave after wave of Byzantine attacks. Procopius and other chroniclers described Taya as fighting with such ferocity that he had to repeatedly switch shields because they became so filled with arrows that they were too heavy to lift. But courage wasn't enough. The Byzantines were too many, too well supplied, too disciplined. By the second day, Taya was killed, his body so pierced by missiles that the Byzantines could hardly recognize him. Just like Totila before him, his men buried him in secret to keep his remains from being used as propaganda. With Taya's death, the Ostrogothic kingdom collapsed completely. This time there was no successor, no regrouping, no hidden stronghold waiting to make a comeback. The Gothic War, the conflict that had burned through Italy for almost 2 decades, was finally over. Narses emerged as the man who completed Justinian's long-promised reconquest of Italy. But victory didn't bring peace. The peninsula Narses had reclaimed was broken almost beyond repair. 20 years of warfare had hollowed out towns, ruined farmland, and destroyed trade. Entire families had vanished. Some regions were nearly empty. The Roman dream Justinian had wanted to restore a thriving, unified Italy was almost impossible to rebuild. Still, the empire pushed forward. Narses remained in Italy as a civil administrator, overseeing reconstruction, stabilizing cities, and trying to bring order to a traumatized land. Ironically, despite being the one who ended Gothic rule, Narses was often more respected by local Italians than the imperial bureaucrats who followed him. He governed with discipline, but also with a sense of responsibility and fairness that won him support. Yet even this chapter didn't end quietly. Decades later, rumors spread in Constantinople that Narses had become too powerful, too independent. Some claimed that Empress Sophia insulted him, saying she would send him to weave among the women, mocking his status as a eunuch. In response, at least according to one famous story, Narses supposedly replied, "Then I shall weave her a rope she will not forget." Whether true or not, Justinian's successors recalled him from Italy, ending the career of one of the most unlikely and brilliant commanders in Roman history. The aftermath of the Gothic War reshaped Europe in ways no one at the time could have imagined. With the Ostrogoths wiped out, Italy briefly returned to imperial control, but the victory was short-lived. Only a few years after Narses' death, the Lombards swept into Italy, taking advantage of a weakened, depopulated land. Their arrival shattered imperial dominance once again, carving out new kingdoms and permanently altering the political map of the peninsula. The dream of a restored Roman West faded for good, and yet, the story of Totila Narses in the Battle of Taginae remains one of the most dramatic closing chapters of Rome's long military history, a moment when ancient Roman tactics fused with early medieval warfare, when a eunuch general outmaneuvered one of the most charismatic barbarian kings of the age, and when the fate of an entire people was decided in a single afternoon on the fields of Umbria. It's a reminder that history isn't always shaped by the biggest armies or the strongest warriors. Sometimes, it turns on the decisions of unlikely leaders, desperate gambles, brilliant strategies, and moments when entire nations stand on the edge of disappearance. And in the case of the Ostrogoths, that edge came at Taginae, and the final fall came on the slopes of Vesuvius. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Gothic War and want more cinematic breakdowns of battles, empires, and the people who shaped them, make sure to like the video, subscribe, And drop a comment about which conflict or historical figure you want to explore next.